What is up, YouTube? So the 3.28 Twitch reveal has just dropped, and same with the patch notes for 3.28, which I'll link in the description below. And here are my notes for pretty much all of the major points from both the patch notes and from the stream, and I'm going to go over that with you really quick. So let's start off with the league mechanic, which is going to be called Mirage. And what essentially happens is there's going to be a zone generated in every single map. Generally, it's going to be a circle, but it's a certain volume. That's the most important part. So if the circle doesn't fit, it'll just kind of flood into the rest of the map. So every map will have roughly the same amount of area being covered by the Mirage. And the Mirage will just have a bunch of extra monsters in it, as well as a juicing mechanic. So before you start every Mirage, there will be 3 options that you can pick from, and you can only pick one option out of the 3. So those 3 will cycle, but they can be really, really meaningful things, such as having Portal and Wisdom Scrolls replaced with just any other currency drops. So you end up getting an insane amount of additional currency, or other options that aren't quite as good. And I think what'll end up happening is that you will skip a lot of the bad juiced Mirages and then, do the Insano ones that are like the Portal or Wisdom Scroll removal ones. Okay, so the last thing for the league mechanic is that there's an introduction of these new currencies called Jin coins. And essentially the way they work is that they can only be used on max level skill gems. And when they are used on them, they will add a level 1 support of any support gem that could potentially actually be utilized onto the skill itself. So the example that they gave was Split Arrow, having then be supported by a level 1 Vicious Projectiles. This, of course, then corrupts the gem, so you can't just reroll it infinitely. But this is something that is going to essentially give you access to 7 link skills. Not quite 7 link, because they're only gonna be level 1, but like 6.5 link or whatever the actual calculation is. But essentially it's a little bit more power creep, a little bit more power. Top of that, the Mirage duplicates all league mechanics in the area of the Mirage. So if you are lucky enough, if you're running Blight, for example, and you are lucky enough to have one of your Blights spawn in the Mirage, and it seems from the teaser that they gave us, the Mirage is actually quite large, so this will happen pretty frequently, then you will be able to run 2 Blights for that map. Same thing for Harvest, same thing for Ultimatum, whatever. So the Mirage actually, I think, has a pretty significant potential to juice your maps. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty simple mechanic. There's a lot of other QOL stuff going on here and a lot of changes that they made to the game itself. So let's get into that next. So map QOL, so progressing through the Atlas is a lot quicker now. You only need to complete 10 of like the 20 something unique maps in order to get the Atlas points for that, which is really, really nice. But way more importantly, you won't just drop a Dunes map anymore. Instead, it'll be like PoE2 where you'll drop like a Waystone. You'll drop like a tier 13, tier 10, tier 2, tier 16 Waystone. And then you can put that Waystone into the map and pick whichever map you want. So you essentially have infinite sustain of whatever map you want. And at the same time, you don't need to Orb of Horizon and switch your maps in order to progress your Atlas. You can now just go, oh, it's a Dune, it's a Lighthouse, whatever. I have the Waystone tier 15. I'm just putting that into the corresponding map that I want to run. So it makes map sustain in the end game a lot easier, but more importantly, it also makes, the Atlas progression a lot quicker, which I think is a really cool QOL addition to the Atlas progression, because unless you're like Havoc, your Atlas progression was kind of slow, and this will speed it up pretty significantly. It seems like they renamed tier 17 maps to Nightmare maps, and they got rid of some of the shitter mods for like the 16.5s and the 17 maps. So for example, there's no more like 3 out of 10 seconds of dealing no damage every single map, and there's no more of like the reduced action speed every time you use an ability. So I think that's a big W all around. Additionally, there's a huge change that they made. They are going to double the amount of currency drops from ground loot. So this is like what you drop from just killing normal monsters. And that's not 2x the amount of like transmutes or whatever. Like the way they actually worded it was like shifting around drops. So you will end up having like 2x the amount of like good currency drops, Divines, Chaos Orbs, and actually like Fracturing Orbs now, because they got rid of the Harbinger mechanic entirely. And they now move the Ancient Orb and Fracturing Orb drops into the main currency drop pool now. So that will be a lot better, I think, for crafters, because, after like a few weeks into the league, people stop farming Harbinger and Fracturing Orbs end up becoming like 10, 20 div. And it just becomes way too hard to actually fracture your gear in order to craft decent gear. And overall, I think that's a W as well. To continue with like how map juicing has changed, they added blobs, which are a currency orb that you can add to your Atlas. And what it'll essentially do is create like a blotch or a patch of influenced maps, which when you complete them will make the other influenced maps within that like blob a little bit more effective. And what this looks like is like having 30% more currency drops or 30% more scarab drops. So it's a pretty significant amount of additional juice, which I think is a really, really healthy amount. Currency farming last league was so bad. And this is definitely like, I think going the right direction. Whether or not it's like enough or too much or whatever, we'll have to play the league in order to figure that out. Passing the eyeball test, this seems like really good to me. It looks like gonna be getting the juice that we need. So for King's March, they swapped the crops and the ores. in terms of like the value they would give you for your shipments. So before, the ores would give you like equipment and the crops would give you currency. Now it's going to be the inverse. So you're actually gonna have to farm for ores if you want those like 25, 50 mil shipments that give you like multiple mirror shards, like that kind of thing, which I think is really good because it kind of makes it a little bit less like mobile gamey, where you actually have to like farm for your shipments instead of just like passively like farming crops using your gold. So I like this a lot. And at the same time, I think this also opens up the door for some cool farming methods where you actually hunt for ores, and that actually matters now. Like the Kalgurin ore like nodes on your Atlas and stuff will actually be meaningful. And at the same time, it nerfs this kind of like mobile game AFK style play from, you know, King's March. Breach, there's pretty significant nerfs to Breach as it's going to core now, and this is like expected. Before, they were kind of talking about like the 6-link rate from your equipment graphs was like a 1 in 10, which is like crazy high. They didn't actually say how much lower it's going to be, but they were kind of laughing about 1 in 10 being too high, so I would expect it to be pretty significantly lower. In addition to that, you can also not roll for weapons and quivers, I believe. So you can still look for like 6-link body armors and that kind of stuff, but you will no longer be able to hunt for like tier 1 mods on axes, for example, and then recombine them that way, or wands, etc. So they actually nerfed, I think, the strongest parts of this mechanic, which was just like printing 6 links and also printing like tier 1 rolls for like really hard to obtain like fizz mods, for example, balanced it as a result. I'm not really sure if it's going to be like broken or if it's going to be too weak on launch because we don't know what the actual Atlas mechanics are, but I still suspect that this will be one of the better like early league start farms that you incorporate into your maps, just because getting 6-link body armors at the very least will still be something that's definitely possible and like pretty likely, I think, and just so valuable in the early stages of the league. On top of all this, they also added exceptional supports. So what they kind of said was, in comparison to Awakened supports, which was oftentimes just a better version of the previous support, like, you know, you just get a little bit more damage, that kind of thing. They were hoping that the exceptional supports would be like the previous supports, but like different. You know, they would actually add a meaningful difference to the supports that would make them actually feel different, not just the same thing, but a little bit stronger. And that's pretty much it for like the general buffs and nerfs. I think overall, like this part of, and this was mostly from the stream, I think this was like really cool and exciting. Pretty much everything they said was like something that I wanted to hear. It's like they're buffing loot, they're buffing juicing, they're buffing the QOL, they're removing like mechanics that you don't want to see ever, like doing no damage every 30% of the time, or like having a movement speed or an action speed debuff every time you cast a spell. And then also they like made changes to King's March. It was like 10 out of 10. Everything was looking really, really good. And then the patch notes dropped. And there were some pretty significant nerfs in these patch notes. But just to kind of go over it, like it's going to be really hard to say like whether or not these nerfs and how meaningful they are going to be until we actually see the Atlas tree changes as well. As well as like a lot of it is going to be like, you know, they're adding so much power into like monster drops, for example, and then like they're taking away power from monster drops in the league mechanics. It's kind of hard to determine how much like net the change is going to be. But just to go over like stuff that I noticed were like really meaningful was, I thought, okay, this league is going to be another Blight league because monster drops buffed. Blight is like the best way to farm monster drops in the game right now. It's looking kind of like, oh, actually maybe not, because if you look, it got triple tapped, right? You need to run Blight Scarab of Invigoration. You also need to run Blooming, and you also need to run Blight Heart. Well, Blight Scarab of Invigoration is straight up nerfed off the top by 20%. And then Scarab of Blooming no longer adds additional non-boss waves of monster to each Blight portal. They had this exact same nerf last league as well, which didn't actually work. This thing still was happening, and they're nerfing it again this time. So it's unclear whether or not the nerf will go through or how impactful the nerf will be when it actually does go through, that kind of stuff. And then also the Blight Heart no longer doubles the number of monster waves for the Blight encounters, and now guarantees the portal has 2 additional waves with chances for 3 and 4 to occur. We don't know how much doubling was before. Like, was that 4 additional waves? Was it like 6? Was it 10? So we don't know how much this is actually a nerf to Blight, but it seems like cumulatively through these 3 changes, it could be pretty significant, to the tune of like pretty much like negating how much the benefits for, you know, the 2x additional currency drops are going to be. Please keep in mind, 2x additional currency drops is just currency. It doesn't buff map drops, and it doesn't buff Scarab drops, which is going to be where like 50 to 70% of your actual drops from the Blight are going to be. And on top of that, Blight was also nerfed additional time. There is an increased penalty to gold and map drops from Breach and Blight monsters, which just means that you're going to be seeing less gold and less maps from your Blights. That's just a smaller one for the maps, because maps are probably like 10 to 20% of your drops total. Not having the gold is also kind of bad, but at the same time, you know, like King's March kind of got nerfed, so it's like you don't really need to have that much gold anymore. They're not that bad, but that's also just like worth noting. The biggest nerfs to the Blight were definitely from the nerfs to the Scarabs. There were also a lot of other small or major nerfs. Most notable one besides Blight was the Horned Awakened Scarab now grants 16 plus areas contain bosses from a random Maven invitation. The meta for harvest farming was using Awakened Scarabs to, get the Insano buff to your map device, and that is no longer a possibility with Awakened Scarabs. So harvest got nerfed. Boxes, I think are still going to be okay, but at the same time, a lot of the buffs are going to be to ground loot, and by not getting buffed like everything else, in a way, it's kind of getting nerfed as well. So it's it's going to be a very, very big shakedown of the meta, because a lot of the things that were OP before are getting nerfed, like Blight, Boxes, Breach, with the 3 OP things last league, and those are all just getting nerfed pretty significantly. Although with Blight, we're not sure how significantly that actually is. Anyways, that's pretty much it for I think the major points that are going to be changing. Overall, I think this league has the potential to be really, really good. I would say it's going to be an 8.5 to 9 would be my guess, just based off of all the buffs that they're making, but with all the nerfs that they're making as well, it's going to be hard to say how good that's going to be. But I think the new mechanic is pretty cool. It just kind of depends on how the numbers align for the existing mechanics, because the new mechanic is going to be a multiplier for old mechanics, because the Mirage will buff significantly, the previous mechanics, because you can run them twice some of the time. But at the same time, if the wishes that you get that buff the Mirages themselves end up being pretty broken, then I think the league mechanic on its own will just be broken and really fun. And, who knows if that's going to be the case. I have pretty high hopes for that, but we'll have to see. Anyways, I'm pretty excited for this new league, and I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you think the buffs to ground loot are not enough? They're too much, whatever? And do you think the nerfs to the league mechanics before are going too far and kind of negate the buffs to the ground loot? I'm not really sure where I stand on that yet, but I would love to hear what you guys think. That's all for me. I hope to see you guys again in the next one.